things to relational capture, if that makes sense. So to suck something back up into a system would be precisely the problem, if that makes sense. So that's a roundabout way of not answering your question, I suppose, if that makes that makes sense.
Hi.
Hello.
Yes. So you can hear me basically, right?
I can hear you.
My English is not that good, so please bear with me for a while. So, like, I like this idea of utopian islands taking a different lead from the dystopia and utopia that we generally talk about in academia. So, I'm not alluding to the etymological part of the concept, but just wanted you to elucidate a little bit on in the context you are talking about, like utopian space of the world but not in the world. Are you trying to talk in terms of like economic value, because of which it loses its map in the world, or are you trying to like it's symbolic cultural, in what sense? Like, can you just talk about it a little more? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I think what I'm interested in is, you know, islands work and river islands work will obviously come into this as well. I mean, river islands seem to particularly lend themselves to this kind of stuff, as the opening speaker was saying. What's concerned me over the years, and I think what's concerning a lot of the authors that I was kind of quoting, is the idea of a privileged knowing subject who celebrates the relational generativity of islanders and islander life. You know, we've seen this move all over the globe, and it's not just in critical thought, it's in UN policy making and so forth, to turn to islanders and say, oh, look how relationally generative they are. Look how, let's learn from Indigenous islanders' way of attuning and being resilient and all this kind of stuff. And that's a very productivist way of thinking. In my experience and opinion, it's a mode. Putting it bluntly, it can be quite derogatory, you know. And I think what I'm trying to think through at the moment, like quite a few other people, is modes of refusal of that way of thinking. Now that's extremely difficult in the world, isn't it? Because everything gets sucked up, you know, whether you're doing university research or algorithmic governance or whatever, the whole thing is this constant feeling of relational capture being put to use, whether the river islander or Indigenous islander wants or not. So I think what I'm trying to think through the concept of an atopian space is the idea of trying to create mobilizing devices or heuristic devices which seek to refuse that, which seek to talk about the unavailability of the island to these ongoing modes of relational capture. So as time's gone on, as you can tell, I've started to think through and realize that a lot of the so-called relational approaches that have critiqued the human nature divide and all that are actually just often modernity by other means. So the atopian space is a way of kind of desedimenting that. So, for example, I was talking about the examples of marronage or carnival in the Caribbean, and in our book we talk about dozens of other examples in which people are trying to conceptualize through as a kind of mobilizing way of saying these things desediment the ability to grasp them and put them to productive use. And perhaps that speaks to a broader atmosphere in the world today of being constantly felt that we're just part of a relational capture chain where we're just constantly put to use and put to work by others. I don't know if that answers your question.
Can you hear me, Professor?
Yes.
Yeah. Professor, in your conceptual framework, you kept insisting how you're not thinking about redeeming the world or the people for that matter. I was curious as to how you were thinking about redemption as a process, as a condition in your project, and what is the sense of disturbance you are having with redemption? So
That's an excellent question, because on the one hand, you know, this is about a refusal of capture, refusal and a desedimentation. And I think it's okay to say that that could only ever be figurative at the moment. It couldn't be literal because it's the system's, you know, so totalizing. Everywhere there's cuts and distinctions in the world. And your question is there a redemptive aspect to this, or is there an investment of hope, you know, kind of almost a nihilist hope? I guess to some extent there is, because there's a kind of investment in the kind of Fanon sense that the only answer is to end the world in its current configuration. But at the same time, I don't think it's redemption or hope in the way that it's usually articulated, because it's not utopian or dystopian. It's just a mode of refusal. Perhaps a better way of thinking about it is it feels more just like a current mood, a current atmosphere. You know, we all work for universities. We all know what it's like to feel increasingly constricted in what we're able to do. Everything's monitored, everything's controlled. We're, you know, from the moment you design your research right through to its impact and all that, everything is down to an algorithmic configuration. So the whole nature of research itself on a subconscious level is being reprogrammed. So it's just about kind of trying to create spaces that refuse that. I don't know if that feels like redemption. It just feels like, you know, trying to live, if that makes sense. Trying to live and talk about ideas and do things in a way that you don't feel you're just part of the matrix, that you're part of the kind of ongoing productivist world making. So that's perhaps a mood that we all feel at the moment. And why would Islanders be any different? Yes, I think someone's got their hand up there.
Hey, is it all right for me to ask a question? Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So, yeah, thanks so much. That gave us a lot to think about. And I, agree with the critiques of kind of over-ready celebrations of creolization and critiques of the kind of progressivist modes and, what you've described as instrumentalist capture. I am wondering whether there are other models for thinking about relationality outside of capture, and if so, what some of them might be. You cited Fred Moten and Stefano Harney a few times, but two things about their work occur to me. One is they have an idea not only of fugitivity, that is making yourself unavailable, if I'm translating correctly between the two frameworks, but also of the undercommons, right? The undercommons and the idea of study, which involves close proximity, being together, ongoing, I think, ongoing relation. So I'm wondering then, are you using their work selectively? Is there some aspect of it that doesn't kind of cross the membrane into your system? So that was one question. And the other, perhaps relatedly, since they take a very specific example of the university, Benitez Rojo's example of Carnival is at a very high level of theoretical abstraction. But the other question was how do you make the shift between the figurative and the non-figurative in your work?
Well, great questions. Thank you. I'm jotting them down because I was awake a little bit earlier. My brain's not quite functioning as good. Okay, so Tahani and Moten, and I guess I did talk about it a bit, and their conceptualization of ontology, relation, and things like that. You obviously clearly know these debates. There's obviously debates within those debates. So you have people like Calvin Warren and the Afro-pessimists, they're, and Axel Carrera, who I also quoted, has written a really good piece critiquing the power ontology of Moten. It's very interesting indeed. They say that, well, hang on, this is kind of still black. Blackness still has an ontology here. For Hani and Moten, I guess that wouldn't be the case, and those debates just are going on and not resolved. I think what I just to be generous, what I like about Hani and Moten's work is just the atmosphere it creates. It is supposed to be against being with a capital B, and supposed to be about desedimentation and about and against ontology. But as you say, there's stuff going on in the world. There's still study. There's still carnival. There's still these things that can be put to work. I just think what that speaks to is this just more general shift in critique that I find really quite interesting at the moment. The move against logistics, particularly in the Undercommons and their more recent book, All Incomplete. The move against the constant, relentless capture of being, and the creation of fugitive spaces against that. Whether we call that relational, whether we call that ontology, or blackness is still ontology by other means, I think is open for discussion. Clearly, some people think it is, and some people think it isn't. But for me, it's there's an excitement and a kind of certain generativeness to it. But of course, as in the other debates, so for example, Nahum Dimitri Chandler's power ontology that they draw upon would be much more deconstructive. It's much more Derrida. The abyss of being just wouldn't be available, and the only thing that's available to kind of look at is how there's nothing beyond the violence that produces being. So that's an ongoing conversation, but and I'm writing something at the moment that's trying to draw out the distinctiveness of the different approaches. But it's more just the general atmosphere that I find provocative for what has dominated much relational thought, and I think it's in distinction to that I find interesting. How do you make the figurative literal? I think at the moment you can't, but I think what's going on is in a whole range of studies and research, queer studies, Anthropocene work, Black studies, the figurative is being enrolled as a mobilizing form of critique. And again, that's just about perhaps generating a momentum and an atmosphere against the ongoing relational capture in the world. Does that kind of answer?
Yes, thank you. That was very helpful.
Thanks for your questions. Thanks.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello.
Yeah. My question kind of picks up from the previous. My question picks up from the previous question. You mentioned about the limitations of the relational model. I was wondering, like, if instead of the traditional hierarchies, if we introduce a group of diverse, if we have a multiplicity of relational actors entangled in a network, can that help us subvert some of the hierarchical ontological problems that are associated with the relational model? So can it be a way of approaching the limitations of the relational model, or will it throw up further problems?
Yes, a good question. You know, I guess it all depends how that kind of plays out. We already live in a network society as it is, and you know, it all depends on how you kind of engage and kind of refuse that. Just to come back to what the previous speaker was saying as well about Harney and Moten, you know, the network can never fully capture being. In fact, that's precisely how the network proliferates and keeps recuperating itself. For the algorithm, for the researcher, there's always one more relational capture to become. Yeah, so there's always the reason why there's an explosion of metrics and algorithmic culture and things is precisely because being is actually never sedimented, in the sense that it can't be fully sedimented. So I guess that if you're engaging networks, the kind of role of refusal will be to inhabit those spaces where the network will try and stretch out those spaces of suspension where the network hasn't fully captured yet. Because the network, the only thing the network can do is keep expanding, yeah, and that is actually also the case with relational ways of framing being as well, because it's never static. It proliferates. So it's just so powerful, because you've got to. The world is always just to come. So we need one more mode of sensing it, one more mode of attuning to it, one more mode of relationally capturing it. And I guess if we were talking about Harney and Moten, it's in those moments, it's trying to stretch out those moments of suspension where the network hasn't fully captured that moment, and inhabiting those spaces and stretching them out, if that makes sense.
Yes, like I understood your point.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Pug, for this great presentation. But let me just put the question in a very raw format. I absolutely agree to most of the points that you have raised, but asking some uncomfortable questions. So focusing on river islands, right? One of the major problems since the last few decades had been that there is no focus on river islands at all. So it is ignored in river studies, and it is also ignored in, like island studies. So now the thing is that if we think of this desedimentation as an approach, I may be wrong, maybe I have not been able to grasp all of it. But, the whole idea is that people, South Asians, then Indians, Eastern and Northeast Indians, they are now trying to collaborate, come together so that these river islands get a lot of visibility. But if now we are trying to, not trying to, but if what I understand that if there is a kind of a divisibility, then that may, I mean, there is a danger of throwing the baby out of the bathwater. And I don't know whether this desedimentation approach also to an extent clashes with sedimentary justice, for example. So what I'm trying to say is that how would you like to address, kind of materiality? Because I see materiality absolutely missing in this kind of a discussion. So because when even we are talking about political ecology, so there is a critique that there is no ecology or less ecology in political ecology. So so how are you going to deal with it? So materiality, sedimentary justice, and the world which is very gross. So what would be your approach to that, to the gross world?
So two answers to that. Really good question. The first thing, of course, is what I'm doing is I'm engaging particular framings that are dominant in Ireland's research, and suggesting that there are ways of critiquing those. So for me, whether it's about islands or river islands, as you're saying, it's about holding back and thinking, hang on a sec, the dominant framings that are circulating in the academy, the dominant relational ways of thinking about being and knowing, which will inevitably be imported into thinking about river islands. Do we need to maybe think about those again, or what? Because what could happen in any new field of research is you just take what's circulating dominantly in the academy, the collapse of the human nature divide, relational ontology. What we need to do is just import those into now how we think about river islands, if that's what we're now interested in. And I'm just saying, well, let's just think about that. Are some of those ways of thinking not just modernity and colonialism by other means? So that would be one question. And the other question about like what to do. I mean, I've done work with people in the Caribbean where you're trying to do, this was years ago, you try and do research with, say, some fisher people, and you're trying to decolonize the approach and things like that. And I remember starting up doing a big project with them where, you know, gave all the money, literally all the money went to local people. My university was not pleased at all, as you would imagine. And they were then enrolled in the funding development complex. After about 2 years, they said, if this is development and this is academia and this is the research process where you have to be constantly writing reports, engaging things and doing things, you can just keep it, because I'm not interested. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, in both those cases, it's not necessarily what River Islands research or social movements should necessarily do. It's just creating an awareness that the modern world making project is so prolific and so powerful, and it will just recuperate things. So, you know, with all the injustices in the world that you're saying, withdrawing from particular frameworks of reasoning and particular modes of capture feels like an increasing imperative. Because if you start to articulate justice through these current systems, it doesn't work. It just becomes injustice, because they are just often ways in which the privileged knowing subject can celebrate the relational generativity and resilience of local people, but the world will just carry on by other means. So, as I say, it's about two things. It's about critiquing the frameworks of reasoning, the dominant frameworks of reasoning that will inevitably be parachuted into thinking about River Island. And it's also that kind of awareness that the university research complex is deeply implicated in all that as well. Does that answer your question, but does that give some sort of answer? I think someone's just...
Yeah. Hi, Professor. You can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I have two questions, and I mean, I would be honest, and I don't think I understood all of what you're talking about, but still, I just wanted to engage with the discussion, and because we have been talking about relational within island studies, a lot has been done there, and now we are bringing a new idea of non-relational. So my first question is that how much of non-relational ontology, you know, it will hold true when we look at it from, you know, at the backdrop of Anthropocene, where the, you know, the assertion of non-relational ontology may clash with, you know, very much relational, materiality of the entire process. You know, like we know that the effects or the implications of Anthropocene is not just non-relational, it is very much relational. So how would that hold? And secondly, I'm interested in the process of what was the itch, or what are the empirical basis of the argumentation or the concept that you have made. So I'm very much interested in knowing that. Thank you.
These are really great questions. So first of all, the Anthropocene, Well, as I put up with I agree very much with Claire Colebrook on the concept of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, in my opinion, is about maintaining the modern way of life. The reason why people are so interested in islanders in the West, and I'm just talking, obviously, I'm a white guy from England, is because they're scared to death that modernity is going to end. So they're trying to redeem it. They're trying to find ways to rethink the Western human in ways that will save it from itself. So the whole concept of the Anthropocene for me, I mean, I know people talk a lot about how, for example, we are in the Caribbean or wherever, the end of the world's kind of already happened for us. We had 400 years of slavery. So there's all those debates. But for me, I think the Anthropocene is quite a straightforward thing. The West is very worried and it wants to redeem itself and find new ways to continue to be itself. The planet won't die. The world won't end. There are catastrophic environmental changes taking place. But most Anthropocene discourse, as I understand it, is about the West saving itself from itself. I mean, I talked about Colebrook's recent book. You just look at most Hollywood films, it's about the world kind of ending and then some sort of white Western man finding a way to become human otherwise and redeem the world. And that's, to me, what the Anthropocene's about. In terms of the empirical basis of a non-relational thing, well, I guess there is none. Precisely because any empirical work you could do in the world would just be reaffirming what the world already is. What it is more of a shift in a noticing and a way of critique, in the sense that I guess the Caribbean in particular seems to be in these debates, but it could be anything. It's about a shift in atmosphere, saying, hang on a second, a lot of the kind of stuff that has been framed in these terms of caring and generosity and generativeness to do with relational ontologies and epistemologies is just continuing modernity by other means. And some of the texts that have been produced, it's interesting to feel the kind of palpable anger at a lot of critical Anthropocene work in the majority world, and these things, and the way in which notions of resilience and durability and endurance get rolled out, for indigenous peoples, islanders, and so on, and the anger that's now being written back on that, that famous phrase, don't call us resilient, because that means you can just keep on doing something else to us. So I hope that answers your question. The Anthropocene for me is just a modern kind of way in which modernity is trying to save itself from itself, and the empirical basis is probably more, it's just a shift in ethos, if that makes sense, and a slight anger, or strong anger in some cases. Yes. Oh, no.
No, my hand is up. I just wondered if there are any other questions. I'm happy to hold mine.
You can go ahead and then we can take questions up.
Okay, thanks. Don't know if you can bear another question from me, but
Of course, great.
Well, so I completely hear you about the NGOs and the corporate university models, and the difficulties with those. But I think one of my questions is really, it sounds to me a little bit sometimes as though you're saying any unit of study can be exchanged for any other unit of study. So I loved the way you described the Anthropocene, 100% on board with that. But it sounds like you're saying, well, the island could just as well be anywhere else, right? They're all just instances of an interchangeable, instrumentalizing relationality. So I guess, so yes, I mean, as you will gather, I'm asking for a little more specificity. And I'm saying, well, okay, so even if we think about this at the figurative level, then how are the figures that emerge from the Caribbean different from an island, different from a river island or a coral island or a volcanic island? How do the figures themselves change according to place and geography?
Excellent question. I'm really glad you asked that. So, you know, for my work more generally, you know, where the previous book David Chandler and I did on Anthropocene islands, and then this one on abyssal work, kind of more non-relational stuff in the Caribbean, I would absolutely agree with you, and I should stress that extremely strongly, that geography matters for the development of thought. Yeah, so creolization rises to the surface in abyssal work. The figure of the island rises to the surface in a lot of Anthropocene work. Now, it's not that geography is deterministic, and I don't think you would say that wasn't what you were saying, but it's not like if you look at a river island, it's going to be productive of this way of thinking, or if you look at the Caribbean, it's going to be productive of this way of thinking. But thought develops, you know, on the Anthropocene, on whatever, clearly through engaging geographies, certain types of geographies, and some geographies therefore rise to the surface and are seen as particularly enabling for a particular mode of critique, and other ones don't. When I was, my more general point was the thought that shifts in thought are kind of in the world, yeah? You know, the modes of refusal, the non-relational clearly aren't just taking place in the Caribbean, they're taking place in the university, as we discussed, and all sorts of things. But you're absolutely right in the sense that there will be certain geographies that are seen to be particularly enabling for certain shifts in critique, if that makes sense. And I guess our job is to take an interest in that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I think I really appreciate the way you're talking about paying attention to certain shifts and noticing things, but I'm not always clear when you're calling for attention to what is happening and when you're prescribing a shift. So that's that shift from description to prescription is unclear to me. Of course, and of course, I know your work would be thinking with geography, and also with place. So very helpful. Thank you. And I don't want to take up more time, but really.
I will come back on the prescription description thing, because I think you've raised a really interesting point. You know, at what point as an individual does one slip into a normative prescription, and at what point do you just try and describe what's going on? I'll be really honest, at the moment I'm just trying to get a handle on shifts in thought. And obviously as an island studies scholar, I'm interested in the role that different island regions are playing in that, can play in that, how we can clarify how geography matters to the development of thought in the world, that kind of thing. But I do slip, as someone that works obviously in the university system, but just generally feels the ongoing pressure of relational capture and have friends that are just subject to that world. You can't sometimes help slipping into your own personal feelings about this as well, can you? But at the moment, I'm trying to just get my head around a shift in thought that feels like it's taking place, and what does that mean? But you've asked some really excellent questions. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you for answering.
Any other question? We are almost at the tea break. John, one last question, very small question I have, and it may not make any sense, but I would wonder, how would island studies methodologically look like within a non-relational framing?
Yeah, so I guess you know, like it's looking at how you know, the previous questions have been so thought-provoking and so interesting, and that last question was so interesting in a way, because I'm trying to get my head around it. I'm looking at how others are looking at islands, if that makes sense. So you could literally go and look at Carnival and do a piece of ethnographical work and describe how it's doing desedimentation and how or marinage or something like that. You could go and literally describe how you think it's working, and or talk about an experience like I did, you know, with literal Caribbean fisher people and things like that, and go, well, you know, everything that experience told me was that they were trying to get on, create unions, create social movements, but everything became a mode of relational capture and algorithmic governance, and that killed it. So you could literally do that, but for me, I'm just interested in reading how other people are doing that and trying to work out what patterns of critical thought could be prevalent in that, what analytics we can draw out from how others are turning to engage islands in critical thought today. And it's just through reading and looking at the way in which islands seem to increasingly being enrolled, not as sites of relational generativity, of celebrating resilience, but as sites of opacity. You know, Edward Glisson's absolutely, I mean, he's never gone away, but, you know, really in a lot of critical thought today, his concepts of opacity are rising to the surface really profoundly in work way beyond the Caribbean. And so looking at how other scholars, policymakers, things that are going on are themselves shifting towards more non-relational approaches. They may not call it that, but I guess my job as a scholar is to try and analytically draw out what I feel is going on. Does that answer your question?
It does. Yeah. Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think we should end. Would you mind? It's 11 and we need to take a coffee break. So, is that okay? Yeah. So, John, thank you so much for this really wonderful, thought-provoking talk. People were sleepy, they were sleep deprived, and you woke us all up. So great. And okay, now we have 15 minutes coffee break, and then we'll be back for the next session. Okay. Thanks, John. Thank you.
No worries.